Hi, everyone. Simon, thanks for being here
Hi,
to discuss the future of podcasts, an industry that has repeatedly defied its predictions and continues to prove its significant power amongst other forms of media. In this chat, we're going to explore the growth and the resilience of this industry. And to start it off, I'm Stefano, your host, founder of Podio, the largest podcast platform in the Middle East and North Africa. And Simon over here, you're the chairman of Novel. You've worked directly with the likes of Jeff Bezos, most recently Rupert Murdoch, Richard Branson. So you naturally have a knack for scaling creativity across organizations. And you've seen this industry evolve over the last couple of years. So can you tell us more about your views and your perspective on that?
Sure. Thanks for having me, everyone. Look, my view on podcasts, and I don't really think end platform first. I think and encourage people around me to think story and content first and creative output first. I think the change that the podcast industry is going through is a correction driven by commercial reality, a correction driven by opportunities to take great pieces of content. We recently have had a hit with a show called The Girlfriends, which is a show that started as a podcast story, did extremely well in the English language on podcast platforms, but is now had been taken with our friends at A24 onto streaming. So we increasingly think about multiple proliferation of end user platforms, and I think the people that are concerned, brands that are in the industry that are concerned with that, are also thinking about that, are also thinking about the commercial realities. So the decline, the change that's happening is a correction, and a correction that still speaks to a massive opportunity.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of user-generated content coming out of podcasting, right? Similarly to how we've seen it happen on other platforms, on YouTube and TikTok. We're seeing that trend of, not necessarily high production quality or high production value content, but perhaps better or even good content to talk about. What's your view on, user-generated content as opposed to sort of high production value content that you produce as well at Novel? Do you feel they have that ability to drive virality and sort of foster these sort of cultivated and niche audiences?
I think so. They're going to be in deep verticals. They're going to have the same challenges, but those guys, you look at the influencer environment that you see on Instagram, they tend to work really hard, and they tend to teach the industry a lot about the metrics in terms of what's going on. I would definitely say my observation, I retired from Amazon last year and became chairman of Novel earlier this year. My first reaction as I lift the manhole covers up and look at the industry is surprisingly little data that is available in terms of how you can grow your business and how you can get your stories out in front of people. It's still, I liken it to a toddler that's about to go into its junior and teenage years. And for the industry to succeed, we're going to have to get better at agreeing on common metrics, finding those metrics and sharing those metrics.
Right. And specifically in podcasting, there's this sort of discrepancy between downloads and listens and unique listens, and specifically that's driven mainly because podcasting still relies on RSS, right? And that technology is pretty much old compared to up-and-coming technologies. What sort of adaptation do you feel, or what sort of metrics would you see evolving over time that would sort of help creators and publishers better improve their content?
At the end of the day, start with the consumer and always work backwards. And it's going to be some sort of combination of reach, whether that is reach and impact, attribution, breakthrough, reach. I think you've also got to make a distinction between the brand involvement in the podcast industry to date. You saw a lot of brands pile into podcasts, possibly with the wrong motivation, I would argue. brands and media is as old as the hills, right? So if you think about how soap opera started with Procter and Gamble and the soap industry creating the content, that opportunity and those values still remain today. If you're a brand and you want to be in the space, then I think it behooves you to have a message and to have a point that speaks to the customer. So, for example, if I was Coca-Cola and I made a podcast about how great Coke is, I think you're missing the point. You know, if there is a tension with your business, if there is a point that you want to get across, if you have values, don't use a podcast to sell a product as a long-form advertising format. Use a podcast to speak to a different audience in a different way about the brands that are important, the values that are important to you as a business, and you will have more success.
Yeah, and all of this to say and revolves around the point of fantastic and the art of storytelling. And obviously at Novel, you've sort of cracked that specialty of storytelling. Can you give us perhaps some specific advices or specific examples of some fantastic shows you've created that really crack that ability to drive this behavior within and habit within listeners?
Well, first of all, thanks for that. And you know, it's great for me. I'm closer to the end of my career than I am to the beginning of my career. It's great for me to be around an environment that we can nurture great storytellers, great makers, great producers, great creative talent. And that has always been my modus operandi for the last 35 years. You know, I was mentored by Sir John Hegarty in the ad business. I've always looked up to people like Ridley Scott. You know, Ridley Scott was producing films, 100 commercials a year, is now producing Premium Stevie and podcasts and different, you know, so there were pioneers that led that I hope I am now passing on. We seem to produce hit after hit. I think we are sonically different to a lot of other products out there. I think we pay great attention to the craft of our, you know, we start with the great story. We look for a story. We look for what I've always looked for in terms of advertising or marketing. We look for a different way in. Very often, you know, The Girlfriends, which is our recent global hit, we're not the first people to have told that story, but we looked for a different way in. I think we were very open to what was going on in the world at the time. The association that we had with No More, the domestic abuse charity that, you know, is stitched into that product and a big part of it, that makes me incredibly proud that Anna, the producer who was on the stage before, that we did that. I feel that we made a difference, and I feel it was all the more meaningful as a result of that. So I don't know whether there's some secret sauce, and I'm not going to tell you what that is, because then you'll just copy it and we won't be as successful. But the ingredients are great storytelling, great production, focusing on our makers, our creators, our directors and our producers, and working with our platform partners, you know, great partners like iHeart or BBC Sounds or Wondery. That's important. And in an emerging business as well, it's even more important to get a grip on the metrics and how your end presentation is shaped.
Yeah. And on that specifically, you know, the consequence of nurturing these very sort of loyal communities really drives your ability to obviously drive more revenue streams. And more revenue streams is not necessarily limited to advertising and sponsors, but also going into live events perhaps. And we were discussing about that backstage. So could you tell us more about...
Sure. Look, I think there are ad metrics, there are ad revenue, there's sponsorship revenue, there's micropayments revenue, there is deep vertical brand-orientated revenue. I think there a podcast that becomes a TV show immediately goes into an upper echelon of return, and that in return begets things like events. So I totally see one of the great shows in the UK is a thing called The Rest Is History, you know, with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. They sold out the Albert Hall in London as a result of something that started on a podcast. I totally see the Girlfriends having the ability to become an event and selling out something like this arena, or selling out and becoming and spawning a series of associated and connected series thereafter.
Right. And now touching a bit on the technological advancements of the medium, and also touching on the evolvement of AI and its role within the podcast industry. Do you see it more being involved in the creation process, or more in support for creators when it comes to post-production phases? Like, there's obviously this invaluable human and human creativity that we can't remove out of the equation.
It's good. Look, I'm sure this conference has had many people better qualified than me to talk about potential impact of AI. I would say in my, I started work in 87. Throughout that period, whether I think about the millennium bug, whether I think about transition from physical to digital, in games, in TV, in streaming TV, different revenue models like SVOD, TVOD, there have always been doomsday scenarios, and we've evolved and we've adapted. My approach, I'm in the evolve and adapt rather than the doomsayer. So let's just get that out of the way. I do think that as a tool, its potential is unlike any other. Wouldn't it be great if the host of the Girlfriends, when we create that show, which was a #1 in the English language speaking world, wouldn't it be great if that simultaneously could produce in enough languages to present that, to put that in front of 8 billion users, right? So we're focused on that. We're focused on, and all the businesses that I'm connected in. There's an incredible business called Motorway in London that is a UK unicorn that's using AI to enhance its products and services. There's a great business I'm investing in called Jack, which is a peer-to-peer mental health platform. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you create something that's meaningful, useful, and uses that technology? I do think we're using it in production, we're using it in presentation, we're using it in development to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of development. I think I always think of mental models in terms of communications, whether they need to be direct and information driven, whether they need to be category driven, or whether they need to be brand driven. And that's a Venn diagram, by the way. AI will make every piece of marketing comms in this arena today could be done through AI, freeing up humans to do stuff that surprises and delights. The compulsive lateral thinking that goes into a great breakthrough creative idea. I've not seen how that could do. Some of the thing that I'm most proudest of the advert I'm most proudest of in my life was an ad that we did for Amazon called Priest and Imam. You can still find it online. It's about a priest and an imam who give each other knee pads for Christmas. And I can see how that would have made the process of creating that a lot easier. I don't see how it could have spawned that original kernel of an idea. So to me, yeah, you're right. Look, I'm of course cognizant of the dangers. I'm more focused on the benefits and the tools and the enablement that it allows us to free up creative people to do the tip of the spear stuff rather than the process stuff.
Right, and it's really about that human and that feeling approach that you're touching on, and specifically when it comes to your shows as well. Now, one could argue that I have great content, I have great distribution, and I have great marketing. How can I, as a creator, probably we have a lot of creators in the room, how can I shield myself from the current but also from the future, advancements that are going to happen in this industry that are largely beyond the control of people? Would you say it's mainly focusing on these niche communities and really building their brand equity and loyalty?
Yeah, I guess that's a leading question. That, yeah, I agree with that. But also, one of the biggest skill sets that I learned at Amazon, and the privilege that I had in my time at Amazon and being around people like Jeff, was the absolute addiction to thinking big. And I would counsel anyone, I'm colourblind, failed my maths O-level 4 times, come from South London, came from a working class family, but I wanted to make films and I wanted to be creative. And I knew that in order to do that, to focus on that, I would need to be commercially. So that's shaped my life. I'm part entrepreneur, part creative. And that's my motivation. But, you have to continue to think big. If you aim for the moon, you're going to reach the moon. You aim for Mars, you're definitely going to reach Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and the other planets on the way. So I would urge creatives and creators that are less established, think about how you work together, the principle of co-opetition. There are shared resources that you guys can use, but be insistent on staying true to that think big philosophy.
Yeah, that's great advice. And to sort of wrap it off, and we have a minute and a half left. What are your predictions for the industry, and how are you planning for it at Novel? What are your future plans for the next couple of years?
Look, I think we've covered a lot of that in the conversation to date. I think this increasing, if you look at the end consumer, in the industry, people are talking about, podcasts on YouTube. How can there be a podcast on YouTube? I tell you what, consumers are not thinking that way. Consumers, speak to a 15-year-old out there, they're consuming, content in a multiple of different formats. What we'll continue to see is, I think, a separation of how brands are involved and an assessment of how they're approaching it. And I think I've given you some pointers on what I would be doing if I was a big brand or a small brand getting involved in it. And then I think great stories are going to continue to win through, but those great stories will proliferate across, simultaneously across a end audio platform. You yourself create audio that goes out on podcast, radio, and lots of different end users. But it will be audio and video simultaneously, as well as emerging events. And we've yet to broach the new barrier of games.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Simon, for sharing your insights. It was a pleasure. Thanks for everyone, and great. Thank you.
Thank you.